Hello everyone, and welcome back to MIS 5000, Special Topics in MIS. In today's module, we're going to talk about lists. The learning objectives for this module are as follows. After this module, you should be able to implement lists in Python and use lists and functions together in Python. The list is a special kind of data type. We've already discussed a few very primitive data types, including integer, float, and string. A list is a value that contains multiple values in an ordered sequence. So a couple things I want to point out here. First of all, a list can be treated as a single item, hence it is a value. It can also contain multiple values, and these values are ordered. So in other words, each of these has an index. Lists begin and end with the square brackets, similar to how strings begin and end with quotes. Here are a few examples of a few lists. So you have the first list that has 1, 4, 0, and -5. You also have a list of floats, 12.0 and 13.0. And then you have a list of strings, cat, bat, rat, and elephant. So each element of the list is separated with a comma, and they are ordered as follows. So this is going to be cat will be element number 0, bat will be element 1, rat will be element 2, and elephant will be element 3. Although the length of the list will be 4. Lists can also contain elements that are of different data types. So for example, we could have a list that has integers, floats, and strings all in it. In order to access a list value, you're going to use an index that represents its location. Each value can be retrieved using the index and square brackets next to the list name. For example, if you have the list that has these 4 elements, in order to print the element of 0, you would do that by printing list at 2. So, because remember that the first element is index 0, so you have 0, 1, 2, and 3. So printing list at 2 will print 0. If we print animal 0, we will get cat. If you already have a list, you can update values using the index and the square brackets as well. So for example, if we wanted to change this last element in the first list to 200, we would do that by saying list at 3 equals 200. The 200 would then replace this -5. If we were to run animals at 2 equals dog, we have, let's see, 0, 1, 2, rat would be replaced with dog. There are a few methods, which are special kinds of functions that we can use to manipulate lists. We call these methods after the list name. So in other words, use a period and then include the name of the method and any arguments that that method takes. Here is the append method, which adds new values to a list. So let's say we create an empty list called numbers, which we can do by just setting numbers equal to square brackets with nothing in them. We create the list animals that has cat and dog. If we want to add the number 10 to the list numbers, we simply call numbers.append10. If we want to add turtle, we can run animals.append turtle, and turtle will become the last element in that list. Another important list method is index. So the index method returns the index value of a list value. So the index method is going to take in a list element and then return the index at which that element occurs, if it does occur. So animals.indexCat will return 0, so this statement here will print 0 to the screen. We can also use the insert method. So while append simply appends whatever element you're trying to add to the end of the list, if you want to insert something at a different point in the list than the end, we're going to use insert. So insert takes 2 arguments. First, the index where you want your new element to appear. So in the case of the list animals, where we have cat and dog, we call animals.insert1 and chicken. Chicken will be placed at index 1 in the list. So what will end up happening here is that we will have cat at 0, then we will have chicken at 1, and dog will move to index 2. Another important method is remove. So the remove method removes a list value if it is present. If the value is not present, we will get a value error. So in this example, we have that list animals, which contains cat and dog. If we call animals.removeCat, animals will only have dog in that list. If we put a list into the length function as an argument, it will return the length of the list, or how many values it currently contains. So in these 2 examples, the first list has 4 elements, The second list also has 4 elements, so printing the length of list and animals will both print the number 4 to the screen. We can also use the in and not in operators to detect whether or not a given element is or is not in a list. So again, we have these 2 list examples. If we were to print 4 in list to the screen, we would get a value of true, so it returns a Boolean value of true or false. If we were to print donkey in animals to the screen, we would get a value of false. So it will either return true or false based on whether or not that element is in the list. You can do the same thing with not in as well to check to see if the element does not exist in the list. We can use for loops to access list values using indexes or simply using a variable that represents the values. So you kind of have 2 methods of cycling through each element in a list using a for loop. With the first method, we have our list and we use the index to traverse the entire list. So for example, for I in range 0 through 4, or we could say 0, comma, the length of animals. We print animals at I, so I will take on the values 0 through 3 in this case, and it will print cat, bat, rat, and elephant to the screen. Let's go ahead and take a look at this example in Python. So I have created the list animals with 4 elements. I can also add an element, so let's do animals append monkey, for example. And then let's go ahead and print all of the elements to the screen using a for loop. So we'll start our for loop for I in range, and we will start at 0 and run up until the length of the list. So in this case, that's going to be the length of animals. It has 5 elements, so we'd want it to run until I took on the value of 4. We're now going to use the index to access every single element in the list and print it to the screen. So I'm going to have one statement, print animals at I. Go ahead and run that, and you can see that I get each element printed one after the other to the screen. So this is the first method of accessing every single element individually in a row in the list. It's based on the index. So sometimes you need to use the index, sometimes you do not. The second method, if you don't need to manipulate the index in whatever program it is that you're trying to write, you can also directly cycle through the list in this way. So we have our same list, and we simply run for I in animals. So it'll access all the elements based on however many elements there are, and we will print I. Let's go ahead and test this as well. So for I in animals, print I, and you see we get the same result. So it's tempting to say, you know, that this method is always better. However, you may need to access the index in a program that you're writing. And so I encourage you to think about whether or not you need to access the index or whether you do not. We're now going to take a look at 2 examples. So first, we're going to write a program that does the following. So we're going to first create a list of 5 student names. We'll just make those up. We will then create a list of 5 random numbers between 75 and 100 called grades. We will then print each student name with its corresponding grade. So we'll have 2 lists, each with 5 elements, and we're going to use a for loop to cycle through both and print them to the screen. We're also going to need to calculate the average grade and print that grade as well. So in order to do that, we're going to need to keep a running total and then take the average at the end. So I've queued up the instructions in Python. Let's take a look. So first, we're going to create a list of 5 student first names. I'm just going to call this students. And let's use the following names. So I'm going to use Tom, Mark, Avril, Travis, and Willow. Those will be our 5 students. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a list of 5 random numbers. So in order to do this, I'm going to have to cycle through 5 times with 5 random numbers and append them to an empty list. So let's go ahead and create a list called grades that is empty first, like so. I'm then also, because we're generating random numbers, going to have to import random. Next, I'm going to have to generate the grades. Now we could get extra fancy here and calculate the running total as we do that. However, just for the sake of you seeing everything separately, I'm going to forego that for now. So for I in range, and I'm actually going to base the range off of the number of students that I have. So I'm going to say from 0 to the length of students. What I'm going to want to do is first generate a random number. So we'll call it G, and G will be equal to random rand int 75 100. I'm then going to append G to grades. So we'll do grades.append G. Before I continue, I'm going to test this. So at the end, I'm just going to say print grades and see what I get. Let's take a look. So I was able to successfully append 5 grades, and there they are. If you do want to just print the values of the list to the screen, you can just say print and then include the name of the list in parentheses. So now that we have that, let's do a couple other things. So we need to calculate the average grade. So in order to do this, we're going to keep this pretty simple. Let's make a new variable called grade sum and set it to 0 because we'll need it for our running total. And then do the following. So inside the for loop, I'm going to simply say grade sum is equal to grade sum plus, and I can either access the grade from the list at this point using the index, or I can just add G. So I'll add G in this case. Let's go ahead and run to make sure everything's fine, which it is. The last thing I'm going to do is finally print each student name with their grade and print the average to the screen. So again, I could probably do all of this in one for loop, but for the sake of showing you a few different demonstrations, I'm going to use another for loop here. So for I in range, again, we'll do 0, run it to the length of the students, which I could also use grade since they are equal in length. Now all I want to do is print the name and the corresponding grade to the screen. So we will do the following. So print students at I plus, I'll add a colon, and then add, I'm going to cast it as a string, which I don't think I need to. Let's go ahead and test that. So grades at I, and then at the end, we will print the class average and append the average, which I can calculate inline, or I can calculate in this manner. So we'll do class average equals grade sum divided by the length of grades, which should give us the average. So I will then print class average plus, we'll cast the class average as a string. Let's go ahead and run this. And I do actually get an error here because grades at I is an integer. So I need to cast that as a string as well. Let's go ahead and run that again, and we get the list of the names with the grades and the class average. Now, if I wanted to be a little more clever and clean this up, I could do the following. So, time is very important when it comes to computing. We want to minimize the number of times we actually have to cycle through a list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this line that it prints the students and the grades, and I'm going to put it in the previous for loop. Then just going to get rid of that for loop. And so this works because I've already appended G to grades. So there is an item at grades at I each time we run that. And so you would see returns on the time that only cycling through the list once would actually save you a lot of time if it was a very long list. I will post this example to Blackboard. Let's go ahead and take a look at one more example. So in this example, you're actually going to create a list of lists. And so this is important because you'll have to realize that, a list can be treated as a single item, even though it contains multiple items. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a list called grades that contains 3 lists of 4 grades. So it's really going to be representative of, you're going to have 3 students, a list for each student, and then the 4 grades for that student. So it's going to be a 3 by 4. It will contain 12 items total, but you have to think that the outer list will contain 3 items. So the length of the outer list is 3, and each of the inner lists will have a length of 4. So it's really not 12, it's 3 instances of 4. So we have in each list, you'll have the grade for assignment 1, 2, 3, and 4 for each student. We're also going to combine the idea of functions and lists as well in this example. So next you're going to create a function called average that calculates the average of the first and third assignments of one student. So this is a function, it's going to take in a list of one student's grades, and it will return the average of the first and third assignment for that particular student. And what we want is we want to run a for loop that will print the average of the first and third assignment for each student as shown below. So we'll have average of assignments 1 and 3 for student 1, 2, and 3. Let's go ahead and take a look at this in Python. So the first thing we need to do is create a list called grades. This is going to be our list of lists. And we're just going to hard code this. So I'm going to do this in the following way. So grades equals, and then inside this list, I'm going to set up 3 individual lists. So in order to do this, I'm just going to include 3 cases of square brackets that open and close, and separate them with commas. Now you can keep this all on one line. I like to put them on multiple lines just so that my eyes can kind of better see what I'm working with. So this first one's going to be for the first student, the second one for the second student, and the third one for the third student. And so each of these lists will have 4 elements. So let's just make these up. 75, 80, 70, 82. The second one, let's say 90, 85, 92, 75. The last one, 100, 95, 93, and 91. So take a look at that format. This is how you can have a list of lists. So again, you can put it all on one line. If we were to print this, this is what we would get. You see that it lists all 3 lists inside of that outer list of grades. So I can also print to the screen an individual student's grades by accessing an element of that outer list. And this is what's going to help us run the rest of this program. So for example, if I print grades at 0, you see that I get the grades for that first student. And so our average function is going to take the grades of one particular student, so something like this, either grades at 0, 1, or 2, and calculate the average of the first and third assignments. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and create that function. So to create a function, we start with def. I'm actually going to call it avg, and it will take in a list of grades. So I could use a lot of different things for this. I'm just going to use the letter G. And it's going to return the average of the first and the third assignments. So in order to calculate it, basically what you have to think of is that this is being passed, for example. So this first list element, a list of 4 elements, is actually being passed into here. So in order to get the average of these 2, we have to add the values of this list at 0 and this list at 2 together and divide by 2. So case in point, if I wanted to take the average outside of this, I would simply add, what I would actually do is grades at 0, like that, because you can also do that, plus grades at 0 at 2, and divide that by 2. So I'm just going to simply print this to the screen after casting it, and you see that I get 72.5. So when you're working with a list of lists, this first element represents which list you're accessing, and the second element is referring to the element inside that list. So grade 0, 0 is, in this first list, the first element. Grade 0, 2 is the first list, the third element. With that in mind, we can now return to our function. So the average of the first and third is going to be the sum of G at 0 and G at 2, so the first and third elements, divided by 2. So when the AVG function is called, one of these lists will be passed in. It will calculate the average of the first and the third grade and return that. Now what we want to do is run a for loop that's going to print the average of the first and third assignments for every student. So let's take a look at how that's going to work. So for I in range, we're going to start at 0 and we're going to run it the length of grades. This is so that we can access the grades for each student. So the first student, second, and third. And what I want to show you is that you can call the function average inside of this for loop so that you can access every single list of grades in grades. So we can create a new variable to catch the average, or we can simply print it directly to the screen. I'm going to make a new variable just so you can kind of see what's going on. We'll say the average is equal to AVG grades. Now what actually needs to go in here is grades at elements 0, 1, and 2. So in order to do that, I'm going to pass in grades at I. And just so you can see that it's working, I'm going to print the average so that you can see it run. So you see it cycles through each time. It calculates the average of the first and the third grades. When it calls the function, we catch it using this variable here and then print it to the screen. We're just going to manipulate this a little bit more so that it's a little more readable. So let's go ahead and print the following. So average of assignments 1 and 3 for student. Now I have to rely on the index here because it's going to need to be different each time. So I'm going to have to cast as a string I plus 1 because remember I is 0. So the first time it runs it will need to be 1, then 2, then 3, plus a colon, and finally the average. So when I run this, you'll see that I get that printout. So average of assignments 1 and 3 for student 1, and 2 and 3. And you can see if I don't add 1 to the index, that it'll tell me, okay, for student 0, 1, and 2. So I just need to be aware of what my index looks like each time. So this example is a little bit more complicated than things that we've looked at so far. You're manipulating lists, you're using a list of lists, and then you're working with a function that takes in a list as an argument. So if you have any questions about this example, please let me know. I will also post it to Blackboard.